In topic 22, we're going to continue talking about some of the challenges that the modern world uh, caused for the Roman papacy and for the Pope and the Catholic Church in general. And we're going to talk about a number of things here: constitutionalism, democracy, Napoleon, you name it. Perhaps one of the biggest problems that the modern world gave to the Roman Catholic Church is actually something that we as Americans like, and that is what we would call constitutionalism. Now, we normally think of constitutionalism as being democracy, but constitutionalism is a better word for something like the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution. Um, why I point this out is that democracy, if you really understand that term, suggests that everyone's vote counts equally. And as everyone knows, if you go back into the history of the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights, etc., when you see a phrase like "we the people," that did not originally include every single individual in the United States. It referred originally, especially if you're looking at the original meaning, historical meaning of the Constitution, it referred to certain white men with a certain amount of education and money and a certain amount of land. Those were the individuals included in "we the people." They were the ones who were allowed to vote and make decisions. And even though that term has come to mean many more things in our world today in the 21st century, it the reality is we still don't live in the United States in a true democracy. We live in a representative democracy. If we lived in a true democracy, we wouldn't have something like the Electoral College. The popular vote would simply elect the President of the United States, and we elect representatives in the House and in the Senate to vote on our behalf on certain issues. So that's why we live in a representative democracy. But constitutionalism or democracy, however you want to think of it, it really posed a challenge to the Roman Catholic papacy and to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And I point this out because what's going on is you have the American Revolution and you have the French Revolution going on simultaneously in the 18th century. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Constitution, or as I pointed out in the last lecture, may have plagiarized certain parts of from John Locke. He is in Paris during the French Revolution, and the French have the back of the Americans, and the Americans have the back of the French. And both of these revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, their whole point was to overthrow tyrannical monarchies and to overthrow two different kings, the King of England and overthrow the King of France, because both the French and the colonists were tired of being under the rule of monarchs. Well, long story short, why I say constitutionalism was such a threat to the papacy is the papacy is going to eventually be seen as the ultimate target because it's the ultimate divine right monarchy. The Pope is the ultimate monarch, if you think about it, because the Pope is sitting there in Rome saying, I speak on behalf of Peter, I speak on behalf of Jesus, I speak on behalf of God. This is the last thing you want if you're in the midst of the Enlightenment and in the midst of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and you're starting to say things like, we want a government by the people, for the people. We want, even though it's not entirely true, we want some kind of equality, and we want liberalism, we want intellectual freedom, all these sorts of things. Or even in the amendment, the First Amendment to the Constitution, of the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion. A lot of the ideals of the papacy seem to go directly against this. And this is why I've pointed out in this course that when people talk about the United States being founded on Christian values, it's not founded on Roman Catholicism. It's not founded on those Christian values because the Pope is the ultimate divine right monarch. You're trying to free yourself from these monarchs, so the last thing you want is a religious monarch. And so constitutionalism, even though it's something we treasure, and many people throughout the world treasure today, it was in the 18th century and on an assault to the papacy and to the papal monarchy. What's also going on in the 18th and 19th centuries, and certainly continues on into the 20th century, is that we're starting to see the rise of nationalism versus integralism. Integralism, let me start with that because most people are unfamiliar with it. Integralism is where you sort of integrate both church and state. They work together. The church influences the policy of government. The church influences the policy of state. You haven't seen this really in the United States, but this exists in one way, shape, or form in other countries like Canada, Ireland, England, etc., where you might have something like the Queen of England is the de facto head of the Church of England, even though she's a monarch. Well, there were a lot of precedents for this idea of nationalism versus integralism. Is what's more important, being loyal to the state or being loyal to the church? Is there a way to work both of these things out? And we've seen this throughout the history of Roman Catholicism. First of all, if you go back to the medieval period, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV had a lot of problems back and forth with Pope Gregory VI. And if you remember, Henry II in England fought it out with Thomas Becket, and because of something Henry II said when he was drunk, several of his knights believed him and they went off to Canterbury and killed Becket. But there were always these issues throughout the church, but now they're kind of at a boiling point where whose side are you really on? Are you loyal to the monarchy? Are you loyal to the state? Or are you loyal to the church? And different people had different responses to that throughout Roman Catholic history. In fact, today, people have different responses to that throughout church history. Are you an American before you were Christian, or are you a Christian before you're an American? That sort of thing. And of course, during the English Reformation, Henry VIII and the Church of England, this was a lot about nationalism versus integralism. And Henry kind of came up with this new way of thinking about this issue by saying, no, I have no problem with the Roman Catholic Church, but the real head of the Roman Catholic Church in England should be the King of England, not the Pope sitting in Rome. So this is, along with constitutionalism, this rise of nationalism is going to cause a lot of problems for the papacy as well, because what you have is you have nationalism that is suddenly confronting integralism. It's not so much church and state working together now as it is a lot of people thinking, I'm more loyal to my country than I am to the church, particularly the church in Rome. The other thing that's going on in the 18th century and a bit before that is that Catholicism is becoming more and more localized, which is taking the power away from the Pope. And many Roman Catholic bishops outside of Rome liked this approach. So for instance, in 1682, in the 17th century, you have what are called the Gallican liberties. And these are, just think of them as the French freedoms. And what this was is it was essentially the question being raised of what is the relationship of local churches in France to the church at Rome? How does that work? Are we really 100% under the authority of the Pope and the Bishop of Rome? Or do we get to exercise some sort of local options as French Catholic churches? Well, what happened in France, just to give you an example of this, is the King of France is the head of the Catholic Church in France. And under the Gallican liberties of 1682, the bishops of France supported this idea, that the true head of the Catholic Church in France is the king. So if you have Catholic bishops in France and you have a king who's Catholic in France all supporting this, this is a way of rethinking the relationship between the church in Rome and localized churches in France. In fact, the French clergy in 1790, because of the civil constitution of clergy, were essentially civil servants of the state. If you talked about the French church, you were talking about a state bureaucracy because the French Catholic Church was completely controlled in the 18th century by the state. And this, too, is part of this nationalism versus integralism. Now, popes and bishops might control the doctrine of the church, but what's going on here is the implementation of that doctrine at a local level, well, that might be different. So again here, we have these things that are really, along with all the other things we've talked about, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenments, etc., all of these things are challenging still this papal monarchy. And it wasn't just in France that these new ways of thinking about the relationship between church and state came about. In Austria, we have Emperor Joseph II, whose years are 1765 to 1790. He instituted what is known as Josephism, a very strange word, but let me try and explain for a moment what that means. What the Emperor Joseph II is saying here is, I have the right to name who the bishops are in Austria. In fact, he goes so far as vetoing papal letters in his territory, saying, nope, you cannot bring in letters from the Pope to the bishops that I have named. In other words, he's saying, I have more authority over the church in my area than you do. You might be sort of the symbolic head of the church, but I have the right to control the church in Austria. And what Emperor Joseph is doing here is he's going back to that English idea of the divine right of kings that Henry VIII invoked of, look, if kings are placed in power by God, they have as much right, if not more, than the Pope to appoint bishops and leaders and make decisions in their local territories. In the 1760s, you get a version of this in Germany known as Febronianism, these wonderful words ending in ism. And this is where the German bishops who were in charge of the German church actually said, we get to make more decisions about what goes on in German Catholicism than the Pope in Rome. And all of this, when you look at this in a larger context, this is all coming out of these various European enlightenments. It's coming out of all of these ideas of people wanting to talk about equality and rights and freedom and all these sorts of things. And again, the ultimate symbol of monarchy is the Pope and the papacy in Rome. Now, all of this is taken, of course, to a completely different level with Napoleon. And why shouldn't it be taken to another level with Napoleon? Because Napoleon is very much, Napoleon Bonaparte is very much a larger-than-life figure. Napoleon did not get along well with the papacy. Basically, what Napoleon did is said, no one is above the king. This is like French kings before him saying, I am the state. And, this is nothing new because Napoleon is thinking of himself in terms of an emperor, and he's thinking in terms of an empire. So no one is above him, including the Pope. In fact, to make this point, he takes two popes as prisoners. He takes Pius VI from 1775 to 1799, and then entering into the 19th century, Pius VII from 1800 to 1823. Now, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, that's a gutsy move, an audacious move. If you, as a secular leader, go in there and say, I am so above you as spiritual leader, you thinking you're a spiritual leader, I'm so above you as king, that I'm going to just take you prisoner to make this point, to show you I have more power than you. And if you remember back to that whole idea in Catholicism of there being two swords, the spiritual and the governmental, the religious and the temporal. What Napoleon is saying is that binary, that dichotomy of church and state doesn't exist. I, in fact, hold the temporal sword and the spiritual sword. And by the way, he's also saying the temporal sword, the secular sword, the state sword trumps the spiritual sword. This is a whole new way of thinking about the relationship of church and state. It's not separate here for Napoleon, it's that he is in charge of everything, and the temporal sword trumps the spiritual. Well, fortunately, I guess, in 1814, 1815, after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna gave the Papal States back and released Pius the seventh and said, this Napoleon went too far. But obviously, all of this is going to cause the papacy to say, all right, enough is enough. We have to rethink our power, and in fact, we need to get some of our power back. So in the 1800s, the Roman Catholic Church practiced this thing called ultramontanism. The dictionary definition of ultramontanism is this: it's a clerical political conception within the Catholic Church that places strong emphasis on the prerogatives and powers of the Pope. What that word ultramontanism means is beyond the mountains. In other words, what the church is doing here in the 19th century with ultramontanism is saying power and loyalty flows two ways over the Alps. It goes out from Rome, but then it better come back to Rome. So this was the way of the Catholic Church of saying, no. You people in France who are Catholic, you don't get to exercise a local option and do things differently from what we do in France. Same thing in Austria, same thing in Germany. To do this, what the Roman Catholic Church did is it re-emphasized the cult of Peter, that the Pope speaks on behalf of Peter. That is the unifying principle. The Pope, where Napoleon was saying, no one is above the king. It wasn't that the Pope was saying nobody is above the Pope, but what the Pope is saying here is the Pope is the church. And this goes back to early ideas in 2nd and 3rd century Christianity, where you would have early church fathers saying the bishop is the church. And with this, what happened, and this is somewhat striking to people, is the Pope suddenly becomes an important popular figure. In fact, it's in the 19th century that the Pope becomes an object of devotion, and there starts to be these printed images of the Pope that people have in their houses. It's such a shock to people to learn that, prior to this, a lot of people didn't even know who the Pope was. Your average, everyday, ordinary person didn't know and probably didn't care and didn't see the Pope as a unifying factor for the Roman Catholic Church. But once you get into the 19th centuries, all of this changes, and suddenly the Pope is the church, and the Pope is the figure that unifies all Catholics. Now, Catholics today can't possibly conceive of it being any other way, because the identity of the church, the figurehead of the church, is the Pope. But if you go back into the 17th, 16th, 15th, all the way back in those centuries, well, you don't have television, you don't have a way of getting the image of the Pope out there. But in the 19th century, this changes. And just like Catholics today might have a picture of Pope Francis in their house or some other Pope, certainly you would start to see this practice occurring in the 1800s. So the papal reaction is, no, we're just taking power back, and you need to realize if you're in Germany or France or England or wherever, that loyalty flows both ways. It goes out from Rome over the Alps, but then it better come back. The other thing that is challenging the papacy is the rise of modernism, which we've talked a bit about, and the rise of liberalism. Liberalism is this idea that people should decide their own leaders, they should decide on their own ideas, their own laws, their own beliefs, etc. Now, if you think that way, which many Americans, we all kind of think that way in one way, shape, or form. I mean, in a sense, it's unfortunate, but Americans, whether you're Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, hold to some idea of liberalism in the strict sense of what that word means. Because what you're saying with liberalism is monarchies have no place in this kind of political thinking. We the people is key. And again, the big thing liberalism ends up attacking is the papal monarchy, because how dare one person think they have the right to dictate who's bishop, who's a cardinal, what morality you should follow, what you should believe. And you can see that a lot of the roots of this go back to Luther and the Protestant Reformation. At the same time, modernism is a challenge for the Roman Catholic Church. Eventually, the Roman Catholic Church will embrace forms of modernism after Vatican II, or during and after Vatican II, but modernism is a kind of secular humanism, if you want to think of it that way. All of these things that we value and we actually think are religious divine ideas as Americans, the freedom of speech, the freedom of intellect, the freedom of inquiry, these are really problematic for Catholicism in the 1800s and Catholicism all the way down to Vatican II, because modernism is seen as a threat to the power of the Pope and to the power of the Church. Because all of a sudden, if everybody can think for themselves, what if they don't end up thinking in the way that the Church says they should think? And the other thing that was going on with modernism is that there was this renewed interest in archaeology, which goes back certainly to Napoleon and all of the stuff that was done in Egypt and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and all this sort of stuff. But with archaeology, people became extremely interested in the historical Jesus. Who is Jesus? And is the Jesus of history the same Jesus as the Jesus the Roman Catholic Church has taught for years? Is it the same Jesus that Protestants have been talking about? And what do you do if you find out that the Bible says this happened in history, but then you go and apply archaeological methods or the historical critical method and discover that's not how it occurred at all? Now, again, in the 20th century, the Roman Catholic Church will embrace a lot of this and say this isn't that big of a deal. But this was a tremendous challenge to Roman Catholicism in the 1800s and up to Vatican II in the 1960s. Well, various popes had different reactions to all of these things like modernism and liberalism. And some of these weren't the best reactions, and they were probably overreactions. Pius IX, who was the longest-serving pope in history, 1846 to 1878, he loses the Papal States after the invasion of Italy. He thinks it's a horrible, terrible, horrendous thing. He thinks the cause of this is modernism. He doesn't seem to realize that maybe this is the absolute best thing in the world that ever happened to the Catholic Church. But he creates the Syllabus of Errors in 1864. And what the Syllabus of Errors does is it calls out all modernistic heresies that Pius IX can think of. Now, some people look back at this and say, wow, the problem with this is the Church really saying, we don't want to be part of the modern world. We want to reject it. And what it means to be Catholic is not to be involved with anything modern. But with the Syllabus of Errors, and this is somewhat surprising to people, is Pius IX sets the Church up against all kinds of things that seem normal, even for Catholics today. He speaks out against rationalism. People are often shocked to hear he speaks out against capitalism. He also does speak out against socialism. But he also speaks out against freedom of expression and freedom of thought and all these other things that we all take for granted today, whether somebody's Protestant, Catholic, or whatever. Just simply being in the United States, you take a lot of those things for granted. And here in the 19th century is a pope speaking out against these things, saying these are modernistic heresies. He also, in 1870, issues at Vatican I, a council that occurred in the 19th century, he issues the letter Pastor Aeternus. It's a very important document in the life of Roman Catholicism because this is a document that starts talking about the infallibility of the teaching authority of the Pope. And this is very, very important because he's not saying the Pope as a man, is infallible. The Pope as a man is fallible, but the teaching authority of the Pope and of the papacy is infallible. Sometimes this is simply rendered in a shorthand version as the infallibility of the Pope. That does not mean the Pope as a man is not a sinner. It simply means the teaching authority of the Pope is infallible. But sometimes people are often shocked, Protestant, Catholic, etc., to learn that it's only in the 19th century that this is made official in the Catholic Church. But you can see what Pius IX is doing here. He's circling the wagons. In other words, to protect the Church and say and increase his own authority. But he's increasing it because he's losing his authority. He's losing his power and his grip on the world, on the church, etc. Another pope, Leo the 13th, 1878 to 1903. We will talk about him again this week because he really is the father of Roman Catholic social teaching. He opens up the Vatican archives and tells Protestants, Catholics, etc., if you want to hang out in the Vatican library and see what we've got and study it, I'm totally okay with that. It's a great gesture towards saying we're opening our doors to scholars in the outside world. But at the same time, he makes the mistake of saying, but if you find errors in the Bible, that's impossible. In other words, what he does is he declares the Bible inerrant. He basically says that he believes, like many fundamentalist Christians today, in the doctrine of inerrancy, that there are no errors in the Bible. Now, the problem with that, especially for modern Catholic biblical scholars, is nobody believes that anymore, because if you simply just start opening the Bible and reading it, it's not going to take long before you find contradictions in it. To make a claim like that as a pope is a really big deal. And so while Leo the 13th is trying to open the Catholic Church to the world, he's also making these statements that are simultaneously closing it off. And this was very, very frustrating for Catholic biblical scholars that he said this, because a lot of Catholic biblical scholars at this time were wanting to engage in some of these more modernistic, historical, critical methods. They wanted to use archaeology and all this other sort of stuff, and they weren't really officially allowed to do it until Vatican II in the 1960s. Leo himself, though, was enamored by church history, and he was very open to church history. So he's a complex man, and in fact, one of his great statements was the church has nothing to fear from its history, or her history. So at the same time that he was saying things like this, he was also closing the church off. So he was opening it and closing it simultaneously. And like I said, we'll meet him again because he writes this document called Rerum Novarum on the rights of workers. And on the conditions of labor, rather, is how that translates. And it becomes sort of the standard document for Roman Catholic social teaching and social justice all the way down to this day. And then we have Pius the 10th, and this is right before World War I and World War II, 1903 to 1914. He had his own syllabus of errors, and unfortunately, he demanded loyalty oaths. He especially wanted people that were teaching Bible and theology and history in Catholic seminaries to pledge a oath of loyalty not just to the church, but to the Pope. These today are sometimes called mandatums in schools. Albertus Magnus College, thankfully, does not make anybody do that, but there are some Catholic theology departments and some in universities and colleges and some Catholic seminaries that still make their professors do this. And even if you're tenured, you can get fired if a bishop or an archbishop or the pope or a cardinal thinks you're in error and you violated one of these loyalty oaths. He condemns in the syllabus of errors, he condemns modernism. Some people have seen Pius X as taking a step back or two from Leo the 13th. All kinds of witch hunts, unfortunately, come out of Pius IX's loyalty oaths. In fact, what starts to happen is if a student in a seminary gets a bad grade from a professor, they simply call out the professor and say the professor is teaching heresy, and there really aren't nothing good comes from that. I mean, there's trials start to come about, witch hunts start to come about. There really isn't due process in all of this. In other words, professors after Pius X can just simply be denounced without any evidence, which doesn't seem to fit the American court system, the European court systems, but it's one of these unfortunate things that comes out of several popes reacting to modernism and liberalism. Well, World War I and World War II really change the world as we know it. And we still live in the aftermath of things that obviously happened with World War I and with World War II. One pope in particular, Benedict XV, saw the horrors of World War I. His years are 1914 and 1922, and he did everything he possibly could to stop all of this from ever happening again. This is going to be very, very important in the 20th century when we get into the Cold War, because the Roman Catholic Church, the popes in the Roman Catholic Church, are going to be so vocal about trying to end the arms race and the creation of nuclear weapons, and they're going to start speaking out against war after war after war. And then you have Pius XI, 1929 to 1939, and the Lateran Treaty of 1929. It is Pius XI who said there are no papal states, but there is this thing called Vatican City, which is a city within a city. It resides within Rome. It has its own autonomy. Today, there are ambassadors that come out of Vatican City. People who live there have their own passports, etc. But Pius XI and his successor Pius XII, it's not quite clear what they're doing here and if what they did was right. Pius XI also signs a treaty with Mussolini. Was this done to simply save the Pope? Was it done simply to save the Vatican? A lot of the evidence here isn't clear. And I want to be careful on trying to pronounce any pronouncements on any of this or make any definitive statements on any of this. I tend to think that Pius XI and Pius XII did not do enough during this period, and they played a few too many politics. But to be fair, there are in fact Jewish scholars that will point out that Pius XI and Pius XII in particular did a lot during this period. But one of the things that happens with Pius XI is the popes now kind of become the oracles of God, especially when they start speaking out for peace. But perhaps the most controversial pope in this period is Pius XII, 1939 to 1958. And the scholarship on this is so divided. You will find books like Hitler's Pope. You will find all kinds of other books that defend what Pius had to do, Pius XII had to do. There are, though, a number of questions about how much did he know about the Holocaust, how much did he do to stop it. There are Jewish scholars, as I said, that tend to think he saved hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives. There are other scholars that think he could have done much, much more. People who wonder if he was simply playing politics and trying to save his own neck, the Vatican, etc. It does look like, if you look at the teachings and thinking of the Nazi Party, that they would eventually have gone after Roman Catholics as well, and some Roman Catholics did end up in concentration camps for being Catholic and for standing up for Jews. That's not to minimize what was done to Jews during the Holocaust, but you should know that Pius XII is a controversial figure, and it's very, very hard to figure out exactly whose side he was on, because a lot of the documents, letters, papers, etc. of Pius XII have not been released yet. So it's hard for historians to know exactly which side was he on, and people have wondered, well, if those documents haven't been released, then it must mean he did something bad, and that could be the case. But for your purposes, you should know that he is a controversial pope, and there are a lot of debates among Catholics, among historians, among Jews, as to did he do enough during World War II, the Holocaust, the concentration camps, etc., or did he do too little?